vou chamar, então, o senhor Tom Robinson. O Tom, ele é graduado em Direito e Letras, né, pela Universidade de New South Wales, na Austrália, e ele é vice-presidente de acesso global da JDRF International, né, que é uma instituição que, obviamente, ele pode falar muito mais do que eu a respeito, mas é uma instituição aí também de muitos anos, né, que nasce nos Estados Unidos e se expande para todo o mundo, e que tem um papel hoje em dia muito importante, aí levando o conhecimento, né, e levando esses dados, né, para que os diferentes países possam se organizar no enfrentamento, né, principalmente do diabetes tipo 1 no mundo. Thank you very much, Tom, and we are very excited to have you here. E o Tom agora vai nos apresentar, né, a sua apresentação vai ser lançamento dos dados do T1D Index para cada estado do Brasil. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thanks. Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me turn that off. I'm really excited to be able to speak with you all today, and thank you for making time for me. I work for, as Mark said, an organization called JDRF International, and it's an organization that was founded 50 years ago by people living with type 1 diabetes to try and research new therapies and even cures for the condition. In that time, we've spent, I think, about $3 billion on research for type 1 diabetes. And we've seen the experience of living with type 1 diabetes changing from a very difficult one in the 1970s to one that is much better today with, I think it's around, if you had the latest therapies in 1970 versus the latest therapies today, you get an extra 35 years of life, healthy life. So there's been this profound change from the research, which we're really pleased about. But the reason I'm here today, though, is that when we look around the world, not everyone is benefiting from this research. And so the Global Access team, which I lead, our job is to try and make sure that everyone all around the world lives a life as good as possible with type 1 diabetes and has access to the best possible care that we can get them. And so in that context, one of the things that we're doing is working with other organizations on this type 1 diabetes index, the T1D index. You can see some of the other organizations involved at the bottom of this slide, like Life for a Child or ISPAD or the International Diabetes Federation. And we released the first version last year. And I know many of you participated in reviewing the results and thinking about what it meant for Brazil and how it could be used to advocate for better care in your country. And it was really exciting to see. We also got some useful feedback, though. On this slide, you can see that these are the version 1 numbers we had for Brazil, roughly 590,000 people living with type 1, approximately 33 healthy life years lost to the condition. And there were a few limitations that we knew about when we released it. In conversation with many of you, we've reinforced our sense that we've got to address those limitations. Some of them include, for example, that incidence data mostly comes from the Sao Paulo state, from Bauru, and so it's likely to vary elsewhere. In just a couple of states south, it might be very different, or up in Amazonas or Pará, it's likely to be quite different. And so that's one thing we need to fix. Another is that our first version of the model estimated diagnosis rates as being identical across the entire country, every state the same, urban and remote the same, with little variation. It's likely that that's not the case. It's like the more remote you are, the lower the diagnosis rate would be the expectation. And finally, mortality rates, similarly, we treated consistently across all those different geographies as well. And yet, if you look at the availability of doctors per capita or infant mortality rates, and other metrics of performance, healthcare system performance across Brazil, they vary quite significantly. And so we thought, okay, well, it is likely that type 1 diabetes care also varies significantly. And in addition to these geographic limitations, there are, of course, all the limitations that any model will have. It's a predictive model. It works quite well where we know what the answers should be. It's usually within about 5% of the real world figure, but it is a model. It's a Markov chain model with machine learning subcomponents. And so it's only as good as the data that trains it. So with all these limitations in mind, we've been thinking about, okay, what could we do to make this more useful to you here in Brazil? Could we try, rather than simulating all of Brazil at once as one big country, what if we split Brazil up and treated each state of Brazil as its own country and with its own data and simulated it individually? Would that give us something that's a little more useful? Would that allow us to say, oh, the most important intervention in Amazonas or Piauí is different from the most important in Sao Paulo or Rio? And I think we've got I'm going to share with you some working numbers, the first release of anything like this in any country in the world. And I'm keen to get your feedback on whether this does seem useful and whether you'd be willing and interested to help us in developing this into an official release. So here is what happened when we simulated each state of Brazil as its own country. And what I mean by that is it had its own data on urbanization rates, GDP per capita, various different metrics of health system performance and quality, various different metrics of economic performance and wealth. All of these things informed the original machine learning models when we of the version that we published in the Lancet late last year, version 1.0 of the index. And so applying the exact same approach here, here's what we ended up with. And you can see the color coding here is actually color coding the number of lifetime years lost per state. And you can see some quite significant variation across the country between 32 healthy life years lost in the capital versus 48 healthy life years lost in some of the lower income settings across the country, up in the north, places like Tocantins and so forth. And so what we've done now is, because of these different inputs, why are we seeing these differences? Because of these different inputs, we're now seeing estimates of diagnosis rates that are quite different in different states, and of mortality rates and complication rates that are quite different in different states. One way to summarize it is that, you know, in the states that are color-coded more yellow here, the model's estimating that, you know, the average person is receiving human insulin and probably on average 1 or 2 test strips per day because of supply interruptions or something like that. And so they don't have access to 3 or 4. In the kind of darker green states, the model's estimating that people have more like 2 or 3 test strips per day. And in the red states, it's estimating that people are living with more of a pre-mixed insulin situation and maybe not having access to test strips, maybe having to run their blood glucose a little higher as a result. So that's where we're at. That's the version of the model we've built so far. It's something that we can interrogate further and look at how these figures of prevalence and life expectancy and quality of life, we can look at how they change by gender or in the city versus the rural environment, and calibrate the estimates in that way. And we can also look at how interventions might change things. So, for example, an intervention in the north to make sure that everyone at least has 4 or 5 test strips a day and access to human insulin, that's likely to have a big impact. But perhaps down south in Sao Paulo and Rio, the impact of that is lower, and it's moving to analogs that might have the greater effect in those settings. All of this at the moment is a little bit speculative. You know, this is the first time we've shared these these numbers. And you can see my email address up in the top left there. If you would like to have access so that you can explore this and provide us with comments and feedback, please reach out to me. We'd be very keen to get your input. I think this is not yet perfect. We are working to make it so. And one of the biggest limitations of all is that we still don't have incidence data from different states across Brazil to put into the model. And one of the things that I certainly want to do is fund a study on that front to try and improve our understanding of how incidence might be different in Amazonas or in the very far south of the country or the Northeast and so forth. These are important things so that we can understand this condition and how to fight it. And I just want to be very clear where we're coming from here. This is not research for research's sake. I'm not creating numbers because I'm interested in numbers. I'm creating these numbers because I'm interested in the data being a servant of the advocates. This is here to help secure more test strips, access to analog insulins, devices, better diagnosis, all the things that enable people with diabetes to live really good, rich, full, long lives full of everything that we deserve. So that's where we're at. I'd love to hear from you, and thank you so much for your time.